Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, we're going to be talking about great songs with bad mixes. Is such a thing possible? Yes, absolutely, I think so. I think there are absolutely wonderful songs out there that have mixes that, honestly, if you listen to them, it's like, why do they do that? Yet these songs succeed anyway. Is it in spite of these bad mixes? Or sometimes, is it because of these quote-unquote bad mixes? What exactly does that mean also to have a bad mix? How can a song or even a production be great if it has a bad mix? Can you have not only a great song, but a great production with a bad mix? Maybe. We're going to go deep. We're going to talk about what it means to have a bad mix, why sometimes it doesn't matter, and why, in some rare cases, it might even help. All right, all that and so much more coming up. Before we get into it, I just have to give the briefest of shout outs to this week's sponsors on the SonicScoop podcast. Then you will hear all of my top picks for the worst mixes on the best songs. And I want to hear about yours too in the comments down below. So get your gears turning on what some of your potential answers might be. If you prefer to email me, you can at podcast@sonicscoop.com. All right, here's that sponsor shout out. The biggest sponsor on this podcast always is you. How do you sponsor this podcast? With your likes, consider hitting the like button, the subscribe button, hit that notifications bell, or if you're on an audio-only version, consider giving us a 5-star rating and review on the podcast platform of your choice. But the most important thing you can do to sponsor this podcast is sponsor yourself. Try out one of our full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, which will help you mix faster, better, more creativity and confidence than ever before. Try it out with a 30-day money-back guarantee over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Or if you prefer to learn everything I know about mastering, which is what I do day in and day out these days, you can check it out over at masteringdemystified.com. Also a money-back guarantee on that one. Big shout out and thanks also to our brand sponsors for this week. We've got Soundtoys sponsoring this podcast from the beginning, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Some truly phenomenal mixing tools. All right, let's get right into it. Great songs, bad mixes. I was inspired to do this topic actually years ago. There's been this little kernel sticking in my head. There's a conversation I remember having with an audio engineer friend of mine, a really good mixer in his own right. And he was talking to me about a particular production, a song called Happy by Pharrell Williams. You've probably heard the song. Unless you've been living, sleeping, eating, and rocking out under a rock, you have probably heard the song Happy by Pharrell. It was a smash hit. It was everywhere for years. It's probably still played at every wedding that's currently happening today, like right now. It's being played multiple times in the world at this very moment. And there are great things about that song, a lot of really fun aspects to this song, but my friend, audio engineer in his own right, and a good one, said, this song, Happy, the mix isn't very good. And I thought that was interesting because I could see what he's saying. If you really wanted to pick apart the mix to this song, yeah, like the hi-hat is way louder than it should be in most mixes. And you guys know, if you've listened to multiple episodes of this podcast, how much I hate too loud hi-hats. And also, like the kick drum, it's not that impressive sounding. And the bass, it's kind of muddy and indistinct. Like you can't necessarily really hear with great detail and articulation the exact notes it's playing at all times. But guess what? Who cares about your opinion, Mr. Mix Engineer, Audio Engineer guy? Everyone seemed to have loved the song anyway, and it succeeded wildly. You would be super thrilled with yourself if you had a song that 1/100th of as many people heard and enjoyed as the song Happy. Whether or not it's your cup of tea, you would be satisfied with that kind of reach. Let's just say that. And the mix didn't hold it back, even though we can identify theoretically problems with the mix. But here's the thing. The mix to that song isn't necessarily bad, even though I can point out all of these potential problems with it, ways in which it misses the mark in high fidelity impressiveness. The too loud and somewhat trashy sounding hi-hat that's really apparent should be that way. The actual central groove in that track is not driven by the kick drum or the snare. It's driven by the hi-hat. And me, Mr. I hate too loud hi-hats, absolutely think like you shouldn't have mixed the hi-hat in that song any differently. And the fact that it's kind of a little retro and mid-rangey sounding, and that's part of the character of the song. And it's the same thing with the bass line, because the bass line shouldn't be about distracting you from the vocal and the groove of the song. The fact that it's a little bit muddy and indistinct and not super articulate is kind of a plus. It allows other elements in the song to really occupy that melodic part of your brain, draws your attention to them, and just serves as this funky rhythmic pulse that moves the song forward. So this is one example of a song that arguably has a bad mix from a conventional perspective in some ways, that isn't super impressive sounding, that does things kind of wrong and lets certain instruments not be heard as much as others, and lets certain instruments that usually aren't loud be loud, but it works. So this is an example of a good production, I think, that's served by a quote-unquote bad mix. But there are also other productions that have bad mixes in a way that is almost objective as anything could be in music, where I'm surprised that a song with this production values and it was this popular got away with such a poor mix. And we'll get to that in just a minute. I've got a good example of that for you. But before we go into even further detail with a few more of my top examples of great songs or great productions with bad mixes, I want to set the terms here. What do I mean by a bad mix? Well, first of all, I don't mean a bad recording. There are songs, particularly songs from a long time ago, that were recorded in environments before we even had multi-tracks. So if you're talking about, Alan Lomax recording Robert Johnson, the sound quality isn't very good. This is not what I mean about a bad mix. In fact, if you listen to some of those, the guitar and the vocal are reasonably well balanced against each other. Good job putting your one mic in a decent place in front of a decent performer and it working out, even though you had terrible recording equipment to work with. And in the old school jazz days, you'd have to mix your band by having some of them play louder and some of them play quieter into the one microphone that was available. And if something's a little off in that context, it's not a mix problem, it's a limitation of recording. But you'd be amazed at how well balanced and in a way well mixed some old jazz recordings are that only had one microphone to deal with. They even got savvy enough in some studios to literally wheel certain players forward or back on the soundstage for their solo. Oh, it's time for your solo. Walk forward, or we'll push you forward on a platform on wheels. There were creative ways around these things. But those kind of issues aren't what I mean. Another example, the artist Beck has a lesser-known album called One Foot in the Grave. This is an album that only Beck superfans know about. I was a big Beck fan in high school, and I saw him live. One of the best concerts I've ever seen was seeing Beck live with a couple hundred people. Pretty amazing. But his album, One Foot in the Grave, probably recorded on 4-track cassette. Not very good recording quality, but the mixes on it are actually pretty good. It's not hi-fi sounding, but you have these not super high fidelity tracks that are actually kind of balanced pretty well against each other. And you can't fault the mixes on a lot of those songs, even though the recording quality isn't great. So when I say bad mix, I don't mean bad recording quality or lo-fi recording quality. I mean, you had a multi-track. You could have turned the fader up or down. You could have put a compressor on that one thing. You could have EQ'd that other thing. You didn't. The mix is weird. That's what I mean by bad mix. So arguably my friend thought that Happy was a bad mix. Maybe he's right. Maybe he's wrong. But seemed to work. And ultimately, who cares about your opinion, audio engineer guy? Because clearly, listeners of music didn't care about your opinion. Some other examples that come to mind for me for great productions with bad mixes, I've got to go to David Bowie's Low, which has a few examples, in my opinion, of some really great, creative, awesome productions and great songs with bad mixes. In particular, one of my favorite songs on the entire record comes up. It's a pretty short song called Breaking Glass that I think really helped blaze some new trails, open up some new ground in the world of music production. And there's some really interesting production going on this. Clearly, the snare sound was so kind of worked and overworked, and this is an early example of kind of really over-treating things with gates and getting this kind of sampled feel, and there's just really interesting things going on. The drums of that track, it has this really cool groove. It's just a cool track. But there's this synthesizer that comes in this track more than one time, out of left field. And by left field, I mean literally, it's like hard panned left or something. And it's louder than the rest of the mix. And you're listening to this mix, you're grooving along, and this one synthesizer comes in. And it's like stupidly loud compared to the rest of the mix. And you're like, why did you do that? You had the fader. We're in the multi-track days. Why would you make that so loud? And then a little later, it comes on the other side. And it's like stupid loud. It's just not well balanced at all. And guess what? Still an awesome track. Still an awesome production. Was that moment in there that happens a few times too loud? Go listen to this yourself and tell me I'm wrong. I don't think you can. Objectively too loud. Does it hold back the track? Was it maybe intentional? Maybe the fact that it's intentional makes it good. Or is it still just like not well balanced even though it's intentional? But guess what? Who cares? Mr. Audio Engineer, no one really cares about your opinion. People really love the track. And it's still one of David Bowie's most critically acclaimed and most popular albums to this day. And that's not the only example of something like that going on. I'm reminded of another absolutely great band, Jackson 5. I'm also going to bring up music that my 4-year-old daughter likes because that is a large portion of music I listen to outside the studio these days. Guess what her favorite Jackson 5 song? It's ABC, clearly. So you have this rhythm section stuff that happens in this period in the mid to late 60s and early 70s where they were not knowing what to do with pans yet. And like you'll have a drum kit that's panned all to one side or a bass that's panned all to one side. There's weird panning stuff happening in this particular song. And arguably it's overly thin and overly bright and you can't really hear all of the elements and maybe like high percussion stuff is too loud in the track. And guess what? Nobody cares. Awesome song. Despite all of the mixing things I would have done differently if I was mixing it modern way today, it emphasized the right things to be emphasized to get people feeling the groove and hooking on to the parts of the song that were actually important. And that's something to think about that we'll come back to, because I think there's things that we can learn about for our own mixes about bad mixes on great songs and popular songs. And we've just hinted at one of them there. There are other songs. I'm going to go back old school. I don't know how many tracks they had to record this one on, but Ray Charles, The Mess Around. This is an absolutely awesome old school R&B song, and if you haven't heard it, you should. It is immortalized by John Candy playing the dashboard of his car and almost getting into a car accident, playing along to it in Trains, Planes, and Automobiles. Fantastic film. If you haven't watched it, it's the best Thanksgiving movie ever made. Do you know a better Thanksgiving movie? I mean, we all know the best Christmas movie is Die Hard, but the best Thanksgiving movie, Trains, Planes, and Automobiles. So anyway, this song, really interesting because whenever a new element comes into the mix, it's almost like it's the only element in the mix. Like when the piano comes in, it's all about the piano. That's it. When the vocal comes in, like the whole mix is all about the vocal and that's it. When the horns are playing, it's all about them horns and nothing else in the mix really matters. And yet it totally works. And I never noticed that until I was listening to every song with this podcast idea in mind of bad mixes on great songs. And man, now I had to start going around and listening to everything through this lens. How could there be so many great songs where I can find things that are wrong with them? And I'm like, I know what I have to do. I have to listen to what are obviously the best produced tracks and best mixed tracks in the history of the world to figure out if there's actually such a thing as a perfect mix. So what was the next thing that I had decided I had to listen to find out it is possible for a mix to be perfect? What track could I listen to prove to myself that there's such a thing as a perfect mix? And obviously it could only be one thing. Tears for Fears, And if you don't think that Tears for Fears, at least their very biggest hits, are perfect, then that's because you're wrong. So anyway, I listened to Shout and Everybody Wants to Rule the World and Head Over Heels and Mad World. These, in my opinion, are, even if you don't like the music, potentially perfect productions and perfect mixes. And I listened to them and I was saying, yeah, this is pretty perfect. But I don't know, this vocal in this one spot, it's a little sibilant. Maybe they could control that a little bit better. And you know what? If we were mixing this today, maybe we get a little bit more low-end extension out of it. So I was able to find at least one or two things where an element that was potentially a little bit too bright poked out a little bit more than it could have. Because I put on this hat of wanting to criticize it. And there's a couple of interesting lessons in there too. One of them is that if you're in the mode of criticizing your mix, you can and will find problems with it. Because there is no such thing as a perfect mix. Not even for Tears for Fears, as unbelievable as that might be. And that was something that I kind of already knew, but was glad to remind myself of. That often when we're mixing, we get into this mode of solving problems, figuring out what's wrong and what needs to be improved, what sucks and needs to be made better. And it's important to do that a little bit, some of the time, but I find that when people get better and better and better at what they do, they're not focusing so much on what's wrong and what's bad and what needs to be fixed, but they're focusing on what works, what's good, and what's interesting, and how to enhance it and feature it. And at the very least, even if you can't do that or shouldn't do that for your entire mix, you have to do that at least some of the time, and especially towards the end, if you want to leave this thing in a place where it's like, this is good. Let's be proud of it. Let's tell the world about this song. You've got to get into that mode. And I think that's the only way you could mix something like Beck's One Foot in the Grave, something recorded with cheap mics on cheap equipment with low recording quality and not great rooms, and have the mixes come out being, despite all their flaws, pretty well balanced. I think you can only do that if you take that approach. It's the only way to potentially really enhance and give a vibe to a song like a Mess Around by Ray Charles, or a song like a Happy by Pharrell Williams, where you're just kind of feeling your way through the song and saying, what's making me feel? What's making me move? What's making this song carry me through the world, like propel me into the future? What's doing that? And how do I enhance those things? Now, Tears for Fears, one of the reasons I bring them up and why I think they're such a good example of great mixing is because they're relatively intricate songs where there's so many things happening that you can hear so many of them in such clear detail. And they're an absolutely great example of doing that well. But some of these other examples show that that's not what mixing is all about. You don't have to hear everything clearly. You have to hear the things that matter and are important. And the reason that Tears for Fears mixes sound so good is because their arrangements are that way. You're able to hear these new elements that come in because they're not piling a ton of new elements on top of each other at all times. Elements come in and then go away. And when a new element is introduced, there's space for it. So baked into the arrangement is, here's what's important in this section of the song right now. So the mix feels effortless because the arranging is so good, and baked into the arrangement is leaving some space for these new little bits of ear candy to come in and be heard, because those little bits of ear candy are also a focus in the production style. But in other songs, the thing that you should be focusing on might to a degree be the hi-hat groove and the vocal, and other things are secondary, and making other things take a back seat to them is good mixing. It's not bad mixing in that context. And another thing I experienced when listening to this Tears for Fears stuff, I felt like, maybe that vocal was a little sibilant there, a little harsh there, is my relationship with that criticism changed as soon as I changed the volume knob on my stereo. When I just set it at a slightly more modest listening volume, all of a sudden those issues of harshness were absolutely gone. I mean, it was brilliant when it was loud too, with a simple complaint or caveat, but the relationships in the mix changed when I lowered the level. But also some of the relationships in the low end changed too. How loud the vocal appeared to me, how loud the kick drum appeared to me, all of those changed just because I changed my volume. You know what else would have changed them to some degree as well? Changing my listening environment. And this is another thing, both because of our acoustics and the Fletcher-Munson curve and the way our ears work, our mixes aren't actually static. They're not just like a flat painting on the wall. And to be fair, even a painting isn't static. Things about a painting change depending on how much light is cast on it. If you're looking at it in a room with windows, what the color hue is outside on that day. Is it gray and rainy or bright and warm and sunny? Is it filled with ambient light? Is it spotlights on the picture? What kind of frame is it in? So these things change our perspective of a mix as well. But with all of that said, maybe there are mixes that are just not any good, that still do well. I was trying to find some, and I did find some examples, surprisingly in some really high budget stuff. Some children's music, particularly some Disney children's music, where I heard some actually really good productions and arrangements that didn't have the same kind of budget or care taken in the mix that they did in arrangement, where I would make some more critiques of, come on guys, you had the budget, you probably could have done a better mix and this thing could have been better realized. But in most cases, these weren't like huge hit children's music songs that everyone have heard. I did find one that was interesting. I have a 4-year-old daughter, right? So Little Mermaid, that's relevant, right? And I remember listening to the song Under the Sea. This is the one the crab sings, right? This is one of the 2 songs from the movie. You probably remember the song Under the Sea. It actually has really clever, fun lyrics in it for a kid's song, which, long story short, a lot of the lyrics revolve around the fact that these fish are apparently very afraid of being eaten by human beings, so it makes them very suspicious of the human world, which is kind of weird because it's like, don't they know that fish eat fish too? Anyway, I digress. I was listening to the song Under the Sea with all of its very clever lyrics, and the mix wasn't very good. The vocals were actually like just too quiet, and you couldn't make out a lot of these very clever and intelligent lyrics. And this is from a multi-million-dollar production and probably one of the most successive hundreds upon hundreds of $1 million in ticket sales and revenue films that Disney has done. I mean, just tons of money. And it's like, man, that mix couldn't have been a little bit better. That vocal couldn't have been a little bit more intelligible. The low end couldn't have been a little bit tighter and more inspiring. And that was one where I was like, come on, man. You've got all this great talent, and the vocal is just too quiet. But my relationship with that one changed too. If I turned down the volume fader considerably, then all of a sudden, the low end did start to feel tighter. And all of a sudden, the vocal was sticking out again, and it was more intelligible, and it wasn't getting overshadowed by the other music. Here I was listening to the way I like to listen to music, which is blasting it loud, and the mix did not work loud, in my opinion. But when you turn it down to the level where people are often likely to experience it in a watching a movie at home setting, the mix worked a lot better and the vocal became more intelligible. The low end became better balanced against other things. And if you're not listening to the stuff loud, trying to have fun in that way, it kind of started to work significantly better. And you also have to remember that the norms in certain genres are different than other genres. If I listen to a Broadway cast recording, and I've mastered cast recordings, to my pop and rock and hip hop and electronic music ear, they sound a little underproduced and a little bit underwhelming from a production perspective. But that's just the way those records sound. That's the context they've established. That's what they found works with their listener base. And they're not necessarily supposed to be hyped up and maybe arguably overproduced in the way that some more popular genres are. Yes, if I had that job, I would have done it slightly differently. But guess what? Did it hold back that movie at all? No. Did it hold back that being probably within the top 10 or so most memorable Disney songs? At least top 20, if not 10. No, doesn't hold it back. Still works. So another arguably great song, great arrangement, great production, great writing with a bad mix? I don't know. What is a bad mix anyway? And surely you've heard some songs with arguably great mixes that were very well professionally done that just weren't inspiring and didn't resonate with you. So yeah, long story short, yada, yada, yada. Something we already know. The music, the song, the feeling is more important than the production and the mix. But I don't want to just leave it there, because I think there are some core lessons we can learn from the idea of bad mixes and great songs. And number one is that sometimes the better mix is not the more impressive mix. It's the one that gets the point of the song more. And for me, that's one of the critical takeaways that we can all take in our music. It's not necessarily about getting everything to sound hi-fi and getting everything to sound equally loud and equally apparent at all times. No, it's about directing the listener's focus and attention in ways that's going to make that listener enjoy the song more. And to do that, to enhance enjoyment, we can't spend our entire time working on these tracks obsessing about what's wrong with them and what needs to be fixed. Nah, sometimes we got to flip that on its head and say, what's working? That's what's working. Let's push that. Sometimes we have to give ourselves license to just freewheel it a little bit more and move along with the music a little bit more and figure out what's the thing that makes this track happen. And how do we accentuate that and draw our focus there? And how do we keep other things potentially out of the way of it? And that's big takeaway number one for me. Big takeaway number two for me is that sometimes you can have a too loud moment in a song that makes the song more fun and more memorable and more interesting. Sometimes having a little bit of unbalance in a track makes you realize how well balanced the rest of it is, but also just kind of startles people into paying attention in a kind of cool way. And a lot of great productions have a too loud moment for a particular element that really works. And another core takeaway for me here is that even if you don't have great recording quality, you can still have a really nice, well-balanced mix where things are in good proportion and the track doesn't really feel like it's held back by its production because you made good, tasteful decisions with what you had to work with. And rather than focusing on taking tracks that were maybe recorded in a way that's a little less ideal and trying to make them sound big and impressive and failing at that, you can just let them sometimes be what they are, not try to win the game of being impressive in a quick sip test, but try to win the game of making tasteful choices and respecting the production as it is instead of trying to shoehorn it into being something that it's not. Well, those were some of my key takeaways anyway. Tell me about some of yours. I want to hear in the comments below about examples that you have. What are some songs that strike you as being great songs or even great productions that have bad mixes? Let us know about it in the comments down below. I'd really love to listen to some of your picks, and then maybe we could talk about them on a future episode. Thanks again for joining me. Remember that if you want to sponsor this podcast, the best thing you can do is sponsor yourself. If you've been listening to this episode this long, it means that for some weird reason you don't mind listening to me talk. So if you want to learn to do audio stuff better, who better to learn it from? Check out some of my full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. It will help you learn how to mix better, with more creativity and more confidence than ever before, so you can focus on the things that really matter in the mix and make decisions that really help end listeners connect with the music that they're listening to, which is ultimately so much more important than getting a big, impressive hi-fi sound. Although I'll teach you how to do both. If you prefer to learn everything that I know about mastering, you can also check out Mastering Demystified over at masteringdemystified.com. Both of these courses come with a full 30-day money-back guarantee, so you got absolutely nothing to lose. Big shout out and thanks to our brand sponsors for this week, Sound Toys, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Super fun, vibey stuff to work with. You got to check out the entire bundle, which you can try for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.